Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a forensic reconstruction of what is truly one of the most uniquely disturbing and, I think, financially calculating criminal cases of the 21st century.
Yeah.
The decade-long enterprise operated by Lawrence Wray.
It really is. This is a case that it consistently defies any simple categorization. You know, when we talk about coercive control, we often think of these traditional cults, right?
Something out in a remote compound.
Yeah.
Or based on some radical ideology.
Exactly. But the Wray enterprise was, well, it's a hybrid criminal entity. I mean, we're talking a sophisticated machine of racketeering, sex trafficking, forced labor, and just massive extortion.
And it was incubated, astonishingly, right inside a student dormitory.
At an elite liberal arts college, Sarah Lawrence, in Bronxville, New York. That's the part that's just so hard to wrap your head around.
That geographic origin is, I think, what makes the story so chilling and, so relevant. For 10 whole years, between 2010 and 2020, Larry Wray victimized this cohort of bright, privileged Sarah Lawrence students.
And the operational results were, just catastrophic. We're talking systematic torture, the derailment of promising medical careers, and the calculated theft of over $2.5 million from a single victim.
The legal outcome was just as significant, though. It resulted in a 60-year federal sentence for Wray.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that evolution precisely. We really need to move chronologically, phase by phase, to understand the specific psychological dismantling techniques he was using.
Right. How did he transform from this, middle-aged, seemingly charismatic mentor into the head of a federal racketeering enterprise?
And crucially, how did he weaponize that psychological destruction for such immense, calculated financial gain? That's the key.
To understand the sheer scale of the violence and the financial control that came later, we have to start not with the students, but with the architect himself. Larry Wray was not some novice manipulator when he walked onto that campus.
Oh, not at all. He was a seasoned felon. He had already established a criminal foundation that really provided the blueprint for his future operations.
Okay, so let's unpack that background.
Well, Wray's history shows he already understood federal crime. He understood complex financial manipulation. His foundational experience with the justice system was way back in the early 2000s.
Right.
Specifically, in March of 2000, while he was living out in Warren, New Jersey, Wray was indicted in the Eastern District of New York for a massive pump-and-dump stock scheme.
And that is such critical context. This wasn't like simple petty theft. This was sophisticated securities fraud. This was racketeering.
Absolutely. And that experience taught him invaluable lessons, primarily the mechanics of financial obfuscation, creating false value where none existed, and how to manipulate established systems.
So when he transitioned from stocks to people a decade later,
He just applied the same skills. It's fascinating. He went from creating a false narrative around a company's worth to creating a false narrative around a victim's guilt and their financial debt.
Wow.
The structure of the crime was identical. You establish an imaginary balance sheet, and then you ruthlessly extract capital against it.
And beyond just the financial know-how, Wray also weaponized his own biography into this really potent psychological tool, and that was the carrot connection.
That connection was the bedrock of his whole manufactured mythology. Wray had a verifiable link to the former New York City Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik.
He was his best man, right?
He was Kerik's best man. And Wray didn't just casually mention this. He turned it into proof of his, quote, immense shadowy influence in high places.
I find the specific anecdote used in the sources just so telling about his myth building. He fabricated these stories that made it like he was involved in high-stakes geopolitics.
Oh, yeah. The story about facilitating a meeting between former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and NYC officials.
And claiming he personally put Gorbachev in Kerik's car. It's so specific.
And the psychological utility of that mythology for these young victims was twofold. First, it was just dazzling. He positioned himself as a global player, which made his worldly advice seem incredibly profound.
And second, and this is more important for the control phase,
it was terrifying, exactly. When Wray later started making threats, threatening to have their families investigated or claiming he needed to protect them from these shadowy institutional enemies, the students believed him.
Of course they did.
Why wouldn't they? They had seen the photographic proof. They'd heard the tales confirming he moved in circles with top city officials and four-star generals.
So the threat of, say, disappearing a victim or getting a federal investigation started against their parents became absolutely credible, even though his actual standing was, negligible at that point?
Completely negligible. But going even further back, the sources establish this clear pattern of uh, graphic physical dominance that really foreshadows the kind of torture he used in the later phases.
So this wasn't something that just developed over time. The capacity for this violence was already there.
It was a clear, documented behavioral baseline for violence well before 2010. In 2004, his divorce filing from Theresa Ray already had allegations of physical assault.
But it's the 2006 incident that's just... It's chilling, because it documents this specific mode of torture he later perfected.
It really is. A girlfriend accused Ray of pinning her down and obstructing her breathing by placing his hand over her nose and her mouth.
That detail, the airway restriction, is so crucial. It's a signature method of dominance. It's the ultimate control over life and death.
And the fact that this specific technique restricting the victim's ability to breathe was documented in 2006, it just confirms that the plastic bag suffocation torture he inflicted years later was not random.
No, it was a premeditated, established pattern of dominance and terror.
Exactly. So this is the man, primed with financial sophistication and a proven specific pattern of physical violence, who gains entry into an elite university dormitory in 2010.
Which brings us right to phase one, the infiltration and psychological siege, starting in the fall of 2010. And we have to analyze the geography of the trap, how this organized crime enterprise started right there on a college campus.
The setting was Sloan and Woods 9. It's a townhouse-style dormitory at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. And Ray, 50 years old and recently out of prison, moves into the on-campus housing of his daughter, Talia Ray.
Just that detail alone, him moving in and just staying there for months, is so central to the institutional failure we see later. And the core group of residents who became his victims, I think it's essential to name them: Talia Ray, Daniel Levin, Isabella Pollack, Claudia Erory, Santos Rosario, and several others.
And that physical location, it provided the necessary proximity and, the isolation, but all within a structure of privilege. The fact that a non-student, non-faculty adult, and a former felon, no less, could embed himself in an undergraduate dorm for months without any formal intervention is just...
That's astonishing.
It's an astonishing systemic blind spot that Ray expertly exploited.
Ray didn't start with demands, though. He used what the sources call aggressive benevolence. He started by cooking these elaborate, high-quality communal meals.
Specifically those steak dinners.
Right, the steak dinners for the residents of Sloan and Woods 9.
And this was textbook grooming. For these sophisticated, intelligent, but emotionally vulnerable college sophomores. They're far from home, they're living on cafeteria food and instant ramen.
A home-cooked meal is everything.
A charismatic 50-year-old providing high-quality, free, home-cooked food becomes incredibly potent. Ray used these dinners to establish an immediate asymmetry. He was the provider, the worldly father figure, the mentor who was there to solve all their problems, and he filled a deep emotional void.
And the transition from providing food to this aggressive psychological intrusion was just.
Yeah.
It was swift, and it was masked under the guise of therapy sessions.
Right, but these were not therapeutic sessions in any real sense. They were sophisticated, personalized data mining operations.
Data mining, that's a great way to put it.
Ray would encourage the students to share their deepest feelings, their childhood traumas, specific anxieties. He wasn't solving problems. He was cataloging every secret fear, every past mistake, every family insecurity. All of this information became his ammunition, and it was carefully organized for future use to completely dismantle their sense of self.
So he wasn't just listening. He was actively pathologizing their normal collegiate anxieties. He's convincing these bright students that their perfectly typical worries are actually signs of profound psychological brokenness that only his specialized, intense guidance can fix.
And that dependency was then rapidly cemented by the alienation process. He systematically drove these deep wedges between the students and their biological families.
How did he do that?
Ray claimed their parents were broken or abusive or fundamentally incapable of understanding the students' true potential. So if the only person who validates your feelings and holds the key to your cure is Larry Ray, then you become entirely dependent on his authority.
And that dependency was solidified when the locus of the operation shifted. This is phase 2. Coercive control and false guilt between 2011 and 2013, when they move off campus into Manhattan.
This shift in environment was completely strategic. The group moved from the relative openness of a campus to the intense isolation of New York City in the summer of 2011. Ray convinced several of the roommates to move with him into a very specific, very cramped location.
The sources name the location explicitly. It's a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, specifically in the Waterford condominium at 222 East 93rd Street.
Housing a group of adults in a tiny one-bedroom space creates a total pressure cooker environment. It's a classic coercive control tactic.
So the lack of physical privacy meant total psychological control.
Total. Records show Wray often slept right there in the living room, effectively monitoring all conversations, all movements, their sleep schedules. This eliminated any chance for the victims to privately coordinate, to share doubts, or to recognize the abuse as a group.
And this is the moment we start seeing the infrastructure for that cults of two dynamic established in full.
Yes, that's a crucial concept.
I want to pause on that, the cults of two. You mentioned earlier that this technical insight is so central. How did living together in that apartment, 222 East 93rd Street, actually reinforce their isolation from one another?
It's a brilliant and truly insidious strategy. You know, traditional cults rely on a collective identity. We believe this. But Wray focused on individual, crushing guilt.
So it wasn't a group thing.
Not at all. By convincing Santos Rosario he was a poisoner, and Claudia Drury she was also a poisoner, and maybe telling Daniel Levin he had committed some other moral transgression, he created a unique narrative of debt for each individual.
So they couldn't coordinate.
They couldn't coordinate because they all believed their own specific secret guilt was uniquely terrible, making them unworthy of trust or collaboration. The cults of two meant each victim had a separate, direct relationship of terror with Wray, even while sharing the same claustrophobic living space.
And it was in this apartment that he introduced the core lie that would anchor the next decade of abuse, the fabrication of the poisoning plot.
This lie served as the ultimate psychological trap. It was a massive inversion of reality. Wray claimed that members of the group, specifically naming Claudia Drury and Santos Rosario, were intentionally trying to poison him and his family members.
He didn't just tell them this, though. He used this elaborate, terrifying medical theater to sell the lie. Can you describe how he reinforced the reality of this plot?
He would feign severe physical symptoms, collapsing, vomiting violently, claiming to be on the brink of death. And crucially, he would occasionally take ambulance rides to the hospital.
Which acts as proof.
It acts as undeniable proof. The students witnessing a crisis severe enough for medical professionals to respond, they were forced to conclude that Wray was, in fact, being poisoned, and that therefore confirmed their own alleged culpability.
And once that lie was established, the coercion began, leading to these false confessions.
Wray employed marathon interrogation sessions. I mean, we're talking sessions that would last for 12, 24, even 48 hours straight.
Unbelievable.
He combined this with constant verbal abuse, physical intimidation, to coerce students into confessing to crimes that never happened. And the evidence seized later included these filmed confessions. One key piece of evidence was a video of Claudia Drury, referred to as Female Victim 1, in records detailing how she had allegedly poisoned Wray.
What was the goal of forcing the confessions? Of establishing this profound, crushing sense of guilt?
It established a perpetual state of profound debt. By convincing the victims they had attempted murder, Wray completely inverted the victim-perpetrator dynamic.
They became the bad guys in their own minds.
Exactly. They believed they were morally broken, that they deserved punishment, and critically, that they owed Wray their lives for his mercy in not turning them over to the police. This established a psychological debt that Wray could then monetize endlessly. It made the later forced labor and sex trafficking seem like justifiable reparations.
And a core tool he used to break them down and extract those confessions was the weaponization of sleep.
He weaponized sleep deprivation systematically. He would schedule these counseling sessions deep into the night, often preventing the entire group from sleeping for days at a time.
And that's not just punitive. That's a known torture technique.
It is a known, effective torture technique used to induce psychosis, paranoia, and extreme suggestibility. In that state, the students' grip on objective reality just loosens significantly, making them highly susceptible to Wray's narratives. It allowed him to rewrite their memories and install the false poisoning plot over their own recollections.
So with that dependency cemented, the pretense of mentorship completely disappears. And we move into phase 3, enslavement and graphic degradation, roughly spanning 2013 to 2015. The operation shifts geographically again, and the demand for physical control just escalates.
Around 2013, the locus of abuse expanded to Pinehurst, North Carolina. Wray moved portions of the group there, and he intensified the violence, focusing his viciousness particularly on the Rosario family, Felicia, Yalitza, and Santos Rosario.
This was no longer therapy. This was a labor camp dynamic, just implemented in a suburban setting.
Indeed. Victims were forced into grueling, unpaid manual labor. The indictments detailed the specific, dehumanizing tasks, digging ditches, performing heavy landscaping work on the property for hours on end, often without adequate breaks or food.
And the sources highlight the devastating cost to the Rosario family. Felicia Rosario, a Harvard graduate, an actively working Columbia medical student.
She was pulled out of her residency and forced into this enslavement. The promise of an elite future was just violently stolen from her by the demand for unpaid yard work.
And the degradation was customized. Her brother, Santos Rosario, was made the group's scapegoat, and he endured truly shocking and specific acts of physical and psychological humiliation during this period in Pinehurst.
The physical torture was specifically designed to eradicate his identity, to strip him of every single shred of adult dignity. The sources confirm the existence of what was referred to as the diaper ritual.
Right, and this is hard to even talk about.
It is. Wray forced Santos Rosario, an adult man, to wear a diaper. This was pure, calculated infantilization.
The goal being?
The goal was to make him feel entirely powerless, dependent, and utterly humiliated. It reduces him psychologically to a state of infancy, reinforcing that Wray had total command over his autonomy and his personhood.
And Wray commanded Santos to go even further into coerced self-harm.
Yes. Santos was forced to slap himself repeatedly in the face until his face was visibly swollen and bruised. This is just a devastating control tactic because it forces the victim to become the perpetrator of their own pain.
And it demonstrates Wray's total override of his self-preservation instinct.
It absolutely does. It cements the belief that he was inherently bad and fully under Wray's command, to the extent that he would willingly inflict pain upon himself when ordered.
So as these invented debts mounted, growing from thousands to millions of dollars, the enterprise entered its most financially lucrative and, frankly, its most heinous phase. This is phase 4. Commercialization, torture, and sex trafficking from 2015 to 2019.
This transition was a straightforward criminal pivot to monetization. Wray convinced Claudia Drury that sex trafficking was her only mechanism to pay off the massive fabricated debt she had accrued for poisoning him and damaging his property.
So he framed prostitution not as abuse, but as her path to redemption.
Exactly. And that ensured her compliance through that psychological debt.
The scale of this exploitation was just. It was vast. Between 2015 and 2019, Drury was trafficked through hotels across Manhattan and New Jersey, generating an astonishing total revenue of approximately $2.5 million for Wray over those 4 years.
That is an industrial scale of exploitation. The quotas that Wray imposed were draconian. She testified that she was forced to remit payments averaging anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 per week.
Per week?
Per week. She was working 7 days a week, servicing multiple men daily, functioning essentially as an unwilling, highly disciplined ATM for Larry Wray.
And the victim testimony, it just paints this horrific picture of Wray's behavior during this commercial phase. Drury testified that she was often forced to work while Wray was physically in the next room, sometimes dining casually on burgers and fries, and then immediately collecting the cash proceeds.
And, maintaining that level of production and obedience required extreme, systematic violence. This is where we see the most sadistic aspects of Wray's control manifest, specifically when Drury's earnings dipped or she showed any sign of resistance.
The violence included the return of that specific known pattern of physical control we identified earlier. When Claudia Drury failed to meet her quotas, Wray tortured her using plastic bag suffocation.
He would bind her securely to a chair and then place a plastic bag over her head, tightening it to systematically cut off her air supply, bringing her repeatedly to the very edge of unconsciousness and death.
It's calculated to instill absolute primal terror.
It is, and the connection back to his documented 2006 domestic violence antecedent is just undeniable proof of the premeditation behind this specific method of terror.
And his sadistic toolkit, it extended beyond just suffocation. The court testimony revealed other horrific tools he used to enforce obedience and output.
Yes. Testimony revealed that Wray used pliers, specifically placing them around a victim's tongue, and would hold a knife to their throat to ensure immediate absolute obedience to his financial and sexual demands.
I mean, these tools show the violence wasn't merely reactive, it was an integrated component of his financial management strategy.
Absolutely. And Wray also ensured that the fabricated mythology continued to serve his enforcement needs.
Right, the old political connections.
He maintained control by leveraging those connections, even if they were now completely fictitious. Wray threatened to kidnap Claudia Drury and traffic her to the Middle East if she ever attempted to flee. And after years of myth-building, that threat was psychologically potent and highly credible to a traumatized victim, which locked her into the cycle of exploitation.
The violence and financial management weren't handled only by Wray during this critical phase, though. We see Isabella Pollock, who was once a victim and a roommate, fully transition into Wray's primary lieutenant and co-conspirator.
Pollock's complicity was absolutely essential to the operation's logistics and its financial success. She lived with Wray in Piscataway, New Jersey, during the peak of the trafficking.
What were her specific duties?
Her operational duties included helping manage the online advertisements used for Drury's prostitution, physically collecting the large cash proceeds from Drury, and coordinating the money laundering necessary to obscure the enterprise's revenue.
And she was also present during the torture sessions. She acted as a jailer and enforcer for Wray against her former friend Claudia Drury.
And this just demonstrates the profound psychological damage and the successful mechanism of co-option that Wray achieved. Pollock wasn't just a passive victim anymore. She was an active co-conspirator, ensuring the infrastructure of the organized crime ring was functional.
And this layering of management and financial flow is exactly why the federal RICO charges later stuck.
Precisely.
Okay, let's focus entirely on Phase V, the financial architecture and exposure, before we move to the collapse. The sources provide a really clear statistical breakdown that confirms this was a systematic extraction machine.
The extraction was relentless, and it was multi-pronged. So first, you have the most significant component, which was the $2.5 million generated directly from the commercial sex trafficking of Claudia Drury. That was the largest continuous cash flow stream.
But the operation didn't rely solely on trafficking. He systematically targeted the parental savings of the other students.
Absolutely. Wray extracted hundreds of thousands of dollars from the victims' parents. He would coerce the students into requesting wire transfers and credit card payments from their families, often claiming these funds were needed for, fictitious tuition fees, essential legal emergencies, or medical bills related to his poisoning. He was just draining familial savings under false pretenses.
And even smaller amounts were tracked and documented with this excruciating detail, reinforcing that false debt structure.
Yes. The record shows the systematic nature of these demands. A victim who's identified in documents as male victim 3 was forced to pay tens of thousands of dollars to Wray for what Wray claimed was damaged furniture, kitchen appliances, and household items.
And he kept ledgers.
Meticulous ledgers. Wray maintained these detailed ledgers of false debts, forcing victims to email him itemized lists of what they had supposedly broken, and then assigning these arbitrary high values to justify his relentless financial demands.
This cycle, creating false value in a stock in 2000 and creating false debt in a human being a decade later, is just a terrifying parallel.
It proves the consistency of his methodology. And what's more, the sources confirm that approximately $1 million in proceeds from the crimes, likely the majority of the trafficking revenue, were laundered through a fictitious internet domain business. This just highlights the deliberate financial obfuscation, directly leveraging the skills he honed in his earlier securities fraud scheme.
So this decade of impunity finally broke in 2019, leading to the collapse in judicial reckoning. What was the catalyst?
The hermetic seal broke due to critical media exposure. In April 2019, New York Magazine published a devastating exposé titled The Stolen Kids of Sarah Lawrence.
And that article, based on interviews with victims who had managed to escape and their family members, just forced the whole operation into the public spotlight.
It did. Yet the sources note a really chilling detail. Even after the article was published, Wray's daughter Talia and 2 other students initially denied the claims, publicly defending him.
Which just perfectly illustrates the profound, deep psychological siege.
It does. The control was so pervasive that even when they were presented with objective evidence from the outside world detailing their abuse, they were unable to break free of Wray's narrative of loyalty and debt.
Federal authorities, however, they moved quickly after the publication in their own internal investigation.
On February 11, 2020, the FBI and the NYPD executed a raid on Wray's residence in Piscataway, New Jersey, and that raid was the undoing of the entire enterprise.
The evidence seized secured the comprehensive charges against him.
Agents recovered the smoking gun evidence, digital devices containing the forced video confessions, the email ledgers detailing the fabricated debts, and extensive financial records that directly linked Wray to the sex trafficking proceeds and the money laundering operation.
So Wray was taken into custody, leading to the trial in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York in March of 2022. The charges were comprehensive, reflecting the full scope of the organized crime operation.
15 counts, including racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, extortion, forced labor, and money laundering.
And the key factor here is that racketeering conspiracy charge ICO.
Right. The prosecution successfully argued that Wray's decade-long scheme constituted a criminal enterprise, which allowed them to connect the seemingly disparate acts of psychological torture, forced labor, and financial fraud into one cohesive, organized criminal structure.
And the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 15 counts on April 6, 2022. The trial itself then served as the public forum for the harrowing testimony that detailed the crimes.
The victim testimony was the crucial element. Claudia Drury testified for 5 grueling days, detailing the unremitting sadistic torture, the specific use of suffocation and implements of violence, and the methodical mechanics of the sex trafficking operation.
And Santos Rosario provided that crucial testimony describing the humiliation of the diaper ritual and the psychological devastation that led to his subsequent suicide attempts.
And Felicia Rosario's testimony focused on the derailment of her elite medical career, describing the crushing reality of the forced labor in North Carolina.
The sentencing concluded the judicial reckoning. On January 20, 2023, U.S. District Judge Louis J. Lemon sentenced Lawrence Wray to 60 years in prison. And the judge's statement during sentencing was profoundly important for establishing the gravity of the psychological crime.
It really was. Judge Lehman delivered a searing indictment of Wray's method, he said. He had the evil genius to take people who were young, not minors, and he broke them. He beat his victims, he tortured them, and at times he starved them. He degraded them sexually to the point where they lost any self-worth.
And that quote confirms that the court recognized the abuse wasn't incidental. It was calculated psychological destruction that facilitated financial racketeering.
Judge Lehman firmly established that Wray's crimes were particularly heinous, and the judicial reckoning also extended to Isabella Pollock. She was sentenced to 54 months, or 4.5 years, in February 2023 for her role as co-conspirator, acknowledging her critical management role in the operation's logistics, particularly regarding Claudia Drury.
This entire case forces us to draw some really profound criminological conclusions about how coercive control groups operate, especially in these non-traditional, seemingly privileged settings.
The forensic analysis highlighted the success of that cults of two phenomenon. Wray's method was, genius in its maliciousness. He custom-tailored the abuse, the debt, the paranoia, the guilt to the specific psychology of each individual victim,
which prevented them from ever organizing. Even though they were living together shoulder to shoulder in that cramped apartment at 222 East 93rd Street, they were completely isolated from one another by their unique, crushing, Wray-imposed guilt.
They couldn't share notes, they couldn't compare stories because they believed their secret crime, the imaginary poisoning, was worse than anyone else's.
It created an environment where collective resistance was impossible.
Exactly. The group acted as individuals, perpetually competing for Wray's mercy and his validation, which is the exact opposite of what you typically see in traditional group cult dynamics.
And we have to return to the issue of institutional blindness.
Yeah.
This entire saga just highlights a catastrophic failure of oversight at Sarah Lawrence College.
The fact that Lawrence Wray, a middle-aged, recently released felon, lived in a student dormitory at Slonim Woods 9 for months, cooking and holding court in common areas without any effective intervention from the administration it's a stunning institutional failure.
The open campus culture, which is intended to foster intellectual freedom and a sense of community, it inadvertently created this massive blind spot, a zone of privacy and assumed security, where a predatory adult male could embed himself and initiate a multi-million-dollar organized crime enterprise without any challenge.
And the ultimate measurable toll of this prolonged psychological siege is visible in the tragic mental health devastation. The sources clearly indicate a suicide cluster among the core group members, which demonstrates the profound psychological damage that was inflicted.
By 2014, nearly half of the core group, specifically Santos Rosario, Isabella Pollock, Yalitza Rosario, and Claudia Drury, had attempted suicide.
And we must also acknowledge the tragic death of an associate, Iban Goicoechea, who did commit suicide. These were not random acts of personal despair. They were the direct, measurable results of a psychological warfare campaign designed to eliminate the victim's will to live for anything other than Wray's service.
This case stands as a grim, specific testament to the fact that the most effective mechanisms of racketeering today can be implemented in a college dorm when combined with sophisticated, specific psychological warfare and financial obfuscation.
So this deep dive into the Lawrence Wray enterprise has detailed a decade of graphic torture, systematic financial racketeering, and profound enslavement. And the legal precedent set by his conviction as a RICO enterprise is immense. It signals that coercive control groups, regardless of their lack of traditional religious trappings, can be prosecuted as organized crime.
And understanding the specific mechanism of control used here, the creation of false debt, the specific tools of humiliation like the diaper ritual, and the calculated use of sleep deprivation is critical knowledge for you, the learner. This case demonstrates that sophisticated financial racketeering can embed itself into seemingly safe, highly privileged environments.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for reflection. The Wray enterprise demonstrated that the most effective tool of financial crime isn't necessarily a computer or a ledger, but profound, crushing psychological debt.
If someone, whether a mentor, a leader, or a partner, convinces you that you are fundamentally broken, that you deserve punishment, and that you owe them your life, how far would you go and how much would you sacrifice to pay off that invisible false balance sheet?
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.